So Creature Commandos is the first introduction that we are getting to the DC universe, which of course is going to have things like the Superman film coming up later this year, and basically a whole wide array of TV and movie projects that are going to be the attempts from James Gunn to create a expansive cinematic and television universe for the DC cast of comic book characters. And this is something that I think has been long anticipated because of the kind of abysmal, frankly, state of the DC cinematic universe up to this point, unfortunately. This is the first look we're getting at it with Creature Commandos at the new DC universe. And I think, honestly, it's a really good start. That's like a main thesis of this video, that I really like the Creature Commandos, and I think it's a good start to the DC universe for a wide variety of different reasons. I do think there are some flaws and some parts that weren't perfect that I will definitely talk about too, but overall I'm very happy with it. I enjoyed watching it a lot. I think it's a really fun show. I just had a good time watching it. There's good world building that kind of sets the stage of the world that we're living in. But I think James Gunn seems to want to just kind of dive right in to the universe as much as possible. And then, slowly build stronger connections between the characters to build up to probably like a Justice League movie or something like that in the future. And this Creature Commandos is just one small part of that, but I think it does a very good job of setting the groundwork for a lot of that world building. Another thing I'm going to talk about for probably a large part of this video is just the themes and messages that I would take from this show. The political themes, that's something that I am very interested about, but also just the broader ethos of the TV show and what it kind of, makes us think about. And I would say it's not that surprising that this show ended up being pretty good, because we've seen in Guardians of the Galaxy for 3 movies, we've seen in The Suicide Squad, that James Gunn can direct a fun comic book cast of characters with some underdogs and, unexpected inclusions in it, and that he's good at making that a fun and entertaining time. I think this has a lot of similarities to his previous work, and if you like James Gunn, you're probably going to like it. So with that being said, I'm going to just dive into some of the interesting things that I found out about this show that I think, have some implications for the future of the DCU and just for those who are interested in this piece of media. And so there will be some spoilers for the show throughout the rest of the episode. If you don't want to get spoiled, you probably should go finish the show. The last episode of season 1 is already out now. And then come back around. It's really not that long of a watch, and I think it's definitely worth it. Okay, so the first topic I want to talk about is not something I've seen a lot of discussion about, which is normal. Not everyone's a geopolitical nerd like me and cares about this kind of stuff, but I do think it's actually really interesting, and it is a pretty integral part of the plot of the show. I don't know how much the creators were really focusing on this topic, but it is something that I thought would be interesting to reflect on. And the 2 ways that I think the geopolitics connects into the Creature Commandos show is through the setting of Pokolistan and then through the role of the U.S. government, which are both very essential to the plot of the show, right? The setting of Pokolistan is where a lot of the main conflict of the show takes place. The Queen of Pokolistan is, of course, a very important character, and there's a lot of struggle with the team, both protecting her and attacking her throughout the course of the season. And of course you have Cersei and her army of incel warriors, which are trying to kill the Queen of Pokolistan. So there's kind of a civil conflict plotline going on, which, because of the mystical and aspects of it, I don't think the civil conflict is that interesting politically, because it doesn't seem to me to parallel much else in the real world other than just the existence of civil conflict. I mean, the only really interesting thing is that Cersei is kind of using a mercenary army of incels, which I'll talk about a little bit later about what I think of all that. But in general, it's just a Eastern European country, with some sort of weird geographical quirks. Used to be part of the Czech Republic or Czechia, it seems like. And it's a very small part of the DC universe. It's not really been mentioned in many DC properties, so which is interesting that they decided to bring it back from this. It's a monarchy too, which is, I think, a kind of probably just chosen because the fun stuff you can do with it. You have all these knights and with kind of high tech knights, and then you have the character of the Queen being so important. I get why they chose that. That makes sense. But I just thought that setting was interesting. I always just find it very fascinating whenever comic books like create fake countries. And I think that part of it is an attempt to be less political because, if you pick a real country, there's a lot more people who might be mad at you for how you portray that country. But if you pick a fake country, then they have to at least analyze the work a little bit to see what country is this pretending to be, or what is this reference to, or is this just a totally made up thing, before actually being able to engage with or critique the work. But also it gives you the opportunity to do some world building and create your own stories. You don't have to base it totally on the real world. So I get the appeal of that. I think it's honestly something I enjoy hearing about. And obviously there's a lot of popular media Black Panther, where that's a main part of the storyline, is this fictionalized version of a country. The other aspect where that's interesting is how the U.S. involvement in Pakistan is portrayed. And I think it actually follows a through line from The Suicide Squad as well. And a lot of honestly, a lot of comic book media that involves this Suicide Squad, Secret Force kind of style of team, which is, it portrays the U.S. involvement and a lot of times as very harmful and very bad. And also the people involved as very kind of cruel. Amanda Waller is definitely a very cruel character who, on the one hand is given these kind of noble ambitions of I do actually care about saving the world, which also explicitly often means protecting the United States' interests, right? It's not necessarily the most kind-hearted thing. It is a very nationalistic message there coming from Amanda Waller, but there is a way in which I could see a viewer coming across as sympathetic to her, just because she seems to really be cold hard, wanting to do whatever is necessary to accomplish her goals. But on the other hand, the consequences of the Creature Commandos team and the Suicide Squad, and the same thing happens, is totally destruction for a lot of innocent people, and that includes in this case a lot of people in Pakistan. I would say probably not as much as in the Suicide Squad, where an entire island gets completely destroyed when the U.S. could have just not gotten involved in the first place, both in the history of the island and supporting the monarchy and everything, but also in the timeline of the film, where they contribute to the destruction there and let out lead to a result of events that lets the monster loose. And then, to take it back to this show, Creature Commandos, which I think has a lot of similarities, the plot at the end basically shows that if Amanda Waller had basically never sent the Creature Commandos to do anything whatsoever, things would be pretty much the same, except for less people would have been killed. The mission of killing the princess, which is supposed to be, in the end, is revealed to be actually what ought to be done, would have been accomplished either way. So in reality, I feel like it's kind of you could interpret it as an anti-interventionist message. Do I think that James Gunn is writing this story because he, wants to be a critic of U.S. empire and all this? I don't think that, probably not. But I do think that the story and plot line that he's chosen, probably in large part for, comedic reasons, setting up interesting plot points, telling the story that he wants to tell, it made sense to have, the U.S. Government in this kind of ethical gray area where there's some intrigue there, and where they can also kind of be an antagonist to the Creature Commandos. That makes sense just from a writing perspective, even if it wasn't intended as this political message. But, me interpreting this media, I do see that you can see a political through line here that is critical of U.S. intervention, and provides an example of how U.S. intervention is often fruitless, or actually, in fact, ends up harming the people that it purports to be representing or fighting on behalf of. And also the kind of flip-flopping nature of the U.S. involvement, where they first are there to protect the Queen, and then later they're trying to kill her, kind of also mirrors a lot of real-life U.S. involvements. If you look at the United States in Saddam Hussein in Iraq, there were periods of time where the U.S. was more than happy to support him because, he was helping kill communists in the region, or he was helping do other things that advanced the U.S. Interest. But then later they flipped on him once they decided that actually we don't like this guy, he's bad, and he's going against U.S. interests, basically. So I think that's another interesting thing that parallels real life, and I would say in terms of how the U.S. actually does engage in the world. In this case, it's in a super-powered context where a lot is different. But I think that it is cool to see those parallels in media, and that's something that I, personally for me, makes a show like this a lot more enjoyable, is when there's an actual kind of like tangible political connections to reality present in it, which sometimes is hard to find in a show that, you know, is taking so many liberties with like the fantastical elements of, you know, superpowers, which can be very, you know, can kind of distance the story a little bit from reality. So with this kind of back and forth geopolitical plot going out throughout these 7 episodes, I think it's worth asking, like, how well written is the plot, and does the plot make a whole lot of sense? I think that is one criticism you could levy at this, that yes, you could say, oh, well, you know, you're taking out the theme of the U.S. involvement being pointless, but in another way to look at it is that basically all the actions the characters took throughout the show were kind of completely pointless and didn't really have any real reason behind them. At the end of the day, if they'd just done nothing, things would have been better. Does that actually take away a little bit from the show? I think that's a valid interpretation. I think, you know, a lot of the writing is, you know, done for the conveniences of getting the plot forward, and then when you look back at it, it kind of is like, wow, well, this didn't make a whole lot of sense. Like, an example I've seen pointed out is that the Queen's plan to hire Clayface doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because basically she's operating under the assumption that Amanda Waller will decide to kill her, or maybe she knows that for a fact. I could see that being the case. And that someone will not believe it, specifically like Rick Flag will, Senior will not believe this to be the case, that Cersei is actually evil, and will try to look and find the professor, and then will survive that encounter and tell Waller that the professor was lying, or was actually a duplicate, planted by Clayface, and then Waller will believe that Cersei was faking it the whole time, right? When in the reality it was the Queen faking it and making it look like Cersei was faking it. This whole thing falls apart. It sounds a little bit complicated because it is, and the whole thing falls apart if Rick Flag doesn't go and investigate the professor. And it also would have fallen apart if Clayface just actually succeeded at killing him, which it seems like he was trying to do. And you don't even know for sure that he'll be discovered. And if he is discovered, apparently he's going to just try to kill the people who discover them, so the word doesn't even get out. Like, there's a few layers there where I think I could see where it's not adding up a whole lot or making a whole lot of sense, frankly. And I think an interesting tweet I saw online that kind of describes the way the show flip-flops so much. And I actually don't think this is a bad thing. I think it's okay to have, twists in your plot. But I thought it was funny just to see some of the discourse looking back. And this is actually discussing the topic I want to get into next, which is the quality of the writing of the show. Basically, someone says that they hate how James Gunn writes and depicts women, which, like I said, that's what we're going to get to next. And then someone's like, oh, Nina and the Bride have been stellar in the show. And then they're like, well, what about the other women? It makes it seem like these 2 women are the only ones he cares to write about, and the others are just sex objects or fridge and not really given that fleshed out character they deserve. This person cites Amanda Waller as, an interesting character that's showing humanity here. And then the princess and Cersei are villains and antagonists, right? And then this person's saying, well, I don't think the princess is a villain. And if she is, they didn't make it clear. Someone's like, well, you're not caught up on all the episodes. And then another person's like, well, actually, they just showed that the princess, she was made to look like a villain by Clayface, which is funny because the princess was not made to look like a villain by Clayface. She was, in fact, working with Clayface to make Cersei look like a villain. So, like, all these layers of meaning are being, processed through the episodes and are being changed over time to kind of show the truth in a way that, frankly, is a little bit convoluted. And at the end of the day, there is maybe some, you could say, plot holes or whatever, which I don't think ruin the show at all. But I do kind of get that as a valid critique of the writing. And I think once we get into the next part, we can kind of talk a little bit more about where this thread started and the other valid critiques of the writing about female characters specifically. So James Gunn has definitely gotten critiques before for people who are, arguing that maybe his writing of female characters is not super great. The take I found like I agreed with the most was articulated well in this thread, which is that he writes one specific type of character, and this is also true for men and women, I would say, which is like a complicated killer with a lot of trauma, or like, someone with a lot of like a horrific backstory. Like Rocket the Raccoon fits into this character, Gamora, Harley Quinn, characters in previous works fit into this, but also the Bride fits into this pretty well. A lot of these characters are I think pretty popular and people well received. But then you have someone like Mantis, who I think is pretty universally considered to not be as well written character, and perhaps even like be an offensively written character. So I think that's an interesting, and I kind of agree with that take. This basically also argues that Gunn doesn't know how to restrain himself when handed an R rating, and I think you can definitely see some moments where that is the case in this show. I get where this is coming from, definitely, and there is a level of horniness, frankly, in the show that is a little bit weird. So I agree with this. I don't think it's a like hostile or straight up like anti-woman intention coming from the James Gunn's DCU. I think it's more of like they're not prioritizing female characters as much, and this is just beyond just Creature Commandos like the case when we're looking at things like, why is there no Wonder Woman the like project, right? Why is the most iconic female character in this universe not being incorporated into the early stages of development for the universe, when a lot of these obscure male characters are getting their time in the spotlight, which like is cool to see, but it's like, why isn't this happening for some of these female characters? I think that's a valid question, and I think that it's not necessarily a case of like outright bigotry or anything, but it is more so the subtle ways in which the ways that characters are prioritized can change the way that media representation happens in practice, and can also change the quality of shows. Because I think when you have people who care about and are good at writing a wide range of characters, not just dudes, I do think that makes for a better quality media as well. And I think that when James Gunn is writing these kind of stories that he's good at writing, whether they're about men or women, that's more entertaining than not. And I would hope that we get people who can do that for a variety of different characters in ways that are going to tell those stories correctly. And I think that in this show, I would say that Cersei and the princess, I feel like didn't get fleshed out as much as they could have as characters, and were less interesting than the kind of like traumatic backstory characters, which all of the Creature Commandos essentially have these traumatic backstories that inform who they are and how they ended up where they are. And I think, honestly, a lot of those are pretty well written, and James Gunn seems to know how to do that. The characters outside of that are where there's maybe a little bit of room for criticism about the writing, especially. Cersei, I think you could have done a lot more interesting stuff with in this season. I get that there's only so much time to cram it all in, and she wasn't, incredibly impactful, especially later on in the show. But I do think that that could have been something that is more interesting in the show. And I think the princess also is kind of like, if she's evil in hindsight, you can say like, oh, she's, trying to seduce, members of the U.S. government to bring them onto her side more. And like, you can like look at these narratives, but none of that is really like honestly that compelling as a character. You don't really know much about her or her motivations at all, which like part of that is an intentional mystery on behalf of the writers, but it doesn't give you a whole lot to care about with her character. She's kind of just there for the service of the plot to some extent. So yeah, I do think that the strength of this show and its characters is from the members of the Creature Commandos themselves. I think that they are, very easy to root for in a lot of ways, and you can kind of sympathize with them, especially as you learn their backstories. And I think that that's kind of what the core ethos of this show is about, which is what I'm talking about in the next section. So I talked about a lot of political elements of the show, trying to analyze them. Like, what does this mean? Did the authors intend to do this? Did the authors intend to do that? What are some criticisms of what they were doing? But I think that the actual intended message of the show, which I think it gets across pretty well, is pretty much exactly like what you'd think it would be from the beginning, which is talking about the humanization of these so-called creatures as actual, people that we should care about, or even just as living things we should care about if you don't consider them humans, because, I get that, that's kind of the whole point, is that the government, at least, isn't considering them humans. Okay, now my cat's going in the litter box, so I gotta wait another second. Anyway, so speaking of non-humans, my cats are in the background here, and that's just going to be the norm for my videos, so I hope you like it. I love them, so hope you do too. But back to the what I was talking about there. James Gunn has a history of incorporating non-human characters. I mean, he made these Scooby-Doo movies, obviously, but also Rocket Raccoon, I think, is a very, cool character to include, especially because of the whole, struggle that he has with being an animal, being a raccoon, as a central part of his character. And in interviews that I've seen, he's talked about this. He's talked about how his childhood and his family pets and the pets he has now has influenced him, and that he's very much an animal person, and he really loves that and wants to show that in his media that he produces. And I really kind of respect that as a core message, as someone who also loves animals. I have both my cats in the room with me right now, obviously, and I love them a lot. One of my cats, who's currently scratching at the scratching post over here, has gotten very sick recently, and that's kind of only reminded me of the value that we place in animals and the care that we give for them, and how important that is for a lot of people. And I think that that's something that we should take seriously in our society. We should do that, and we should care about those who are deemed lesser than or less important by society. In this show, the Creature Commandos are considered non-human, even though some of them, in a narrative sense, are basically humans, or used to be a human, or have very things that make them very similar to humans. Maybe Weasel being the most animal-like, in that he kind of just acts like a dog. But you can sense some level of intelligence and humanity there. But I think it's clear from James Gunn's love of all animals that he's not trying to say, these are humans, these are not humans. We should draw this line here in the Creature Commandos. But he's trying to say that we should have respect for everybody, and that we should care for all kinds of creatures. And I think that's a really cool message to have. And yes, it makes for enjoyable watching while you have your cats next to you, to know that the show's message is about care for animals and for everybody. And I appreciate that. On the flip side of that, I think that there are characters that the authors are less interested in humanizing, which honestly, I respect it. And before you get mad at me, I'm talking about literal Nazis, right? The show is very willing to have, specifically with one character, G.I. Robot, whose literal whole thing is killing Nazis, very willing to show gratuitous violence towards Nazis and white supremacists, and James Gunn has, kind of joked about this in interviews, wow, I'm not really taking a brave stand to say I don't like Nazis, but at the same time, with the modern climate of the far right in ascendance in a lot of countries, including the United States, it is cool to see media that isn't really even worried about, the backlash you might get for hating Nazis. The United States did fight a war where U.S. soldiers killed a lot of Nazis. That's what G.I. Robot was a part of, and that's why his character acts that way. And I just thought it was a good opportunity for comedy. It was a good inclusion, and I find it amusing that James Gunn, the way he reacted to it as well. And I just thought I would mention that as well. Kind of on the flip side of humanizing these creatures, we're not really focusing on humanizing Nazis, which I think is cool to see.
Are you worried about alienating a part of your audience?
Yeah, I'm really worried about alienating the Nazi audience. That's been we had a long talks about this. There was a lot of.
We thought we would take a stand against Nazism.
Well, I don't know if it's too soon, but we did think that we would do that.
And I guess the one part of that I think is perhaps a little bit less interesting or well done is the incel army thing. Cersei has this incel army, basically of white dudes with neck beards, and they are just kind of there to be a butt of a joke. I think I didn't really get much in trying to read into that. I don't really get the point of it. Maybe there's something I'm missing, because Cersei ends up being kind of a good guy. Like, she ends up being on the right side of the struggle to stop the end of the world, if you take the plot literally. So I don't really get why the whole incel army thing was included, except for to be a butt of a joke, which is perfectly fine at being the butt of a joke. It can be a funny joke at times during the early episodes of the show. So I don't mind it. If, hiring a bunch of incel mercenaries had something else going on with it, maybe you could go somewhere there that would be interesting other than just laughing at them. But I didn't really feel like it did much with that, frankly. Okay, so I've kind of jumped all over the place in this episode, talking about the characters, talking about some of the plot, talking about the setting of the work and the geopolitical intrigue and conflict and everything. And I guess what I want to end this off on is talking about how this sets the stage for the DC Universe. I've already talked about how I think this does a great job world building, which I think it does. I think it's a good setup for the DC Universe. But I think that the fact that this show demonstrates these interesting political themes is a overall good sign for the DC Universe. And I'm personally excited to see the DC Universe start to unfold. I grew up watching the DC animated universe, specifically the Justice League show, and I loved it. And I think that's really the last time we've seen a coherent DC universe is through the animated universe. And now is an opportunity to have that happen in live action. Obviously, I've got a few things that I think that they could improve on, or things that I critiques I've articulated throughout this review. But overwhelmingly, I'm mostly just excited to see what comes next, and hopeful that it turns out well, and that they do right by these stories and tell interesting stories about these characters. I think this is going to be a very interesting few years to see how the DC universe unfolds, and whether it becomes a genuine success in the way that I think very few cinematic universes have done. I mean, Marvel and Star Wars are the only ones I can think of that are genuinely really widely popular and successful at creating this kind of expansive world. And the previous DC universe didn't quite cut it. So Creature Commandos is a good first step. Like everything, it's not perfect, and there are things that I think a lot of people would like to see in future DC projects that hopefully will show a wide range of characters and do these stories justice. But I am personally more excited for the future of the DC Universe after watching this show, and I think that James Gunn, at the very least, is a competent writer and is capable of telling compelling stories about characters in a way that is entertaining. So I hope to see more good stuff coming out of it. And yeah, that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, share this video with your friends, who maybe other people who watch the show, see what they think. And yeah, I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.